I've just been to see Her Majesty the Queen earlier on, and she agreed to dissolve Parliament for an election.
Hey! Like an unlaid swallow starts a fist fight. Your right to property is antithetical to Christ. Hey!
The new Prime Minister overestimates himself.
Order! For the last 2 years, the DUP, with 10 seats, actually held the balance of power in Westminster. Order!
In 2008, Lehman Brothers Bank took a massive dump all over the global mortgage market by declaring the biggest bankruptcy in all of human history. This sent shockwaves throughout the global financial markets and risked collapsing several banks around the world. Here in the UK, Northern Rock went under and the government ended up owning more than half of the Royal Bank of Scotland, effectively privatising the profits whilst nationalising the losses. What followed was several years of austerity, where the mistakes of the bankers were to be paid for off the backs of the very poorest in society.
I've been beaten up for being called a stranger, for being disabled. I've been spat at, I've had things thrown at me because of the government's rhetoric that people like me are scroungers.
In order to balance the books, the Tories revamped the welfare state, introduced universal credit and the bedroom tax, privatised schools, prisons, parts of the NHS, sold off the Royal Mail and anything else that wasn't nailed down. It was the biggest single transfer of wealth from public hands to private pockets.
Thank you, thank you. We've been recording the music video and it goes like this. I'm hardcore and I know the score, and I am disgusted by the poor, and my chums matter more because we are the law, and I've made sure we're ready for class war.
But if there's one thing the British people love, it's a character. And just when the people needed someone to help them make sense of what was going on, along came Nigel Farage.
The question that I want to ask, that we're all going to ask, is who are you? I'd never heard of you. Nobody in Europe had ever heard of you.
By the end of 2014, 2 Conservative MPs had defected to UKIP, giving them twice as many seats in the House of Commons as the Green Party. This meant the broadcasters had to suddenly start taking them more seriously as an electoral force, and before anyone realised it, the safest UKIP seat in the country was on the set of Question Time. Their meteoric rise was clearly keeping David Cameron awake at night, and to stave off any further defections, he offered an in-out referendum on EU membership if the Conservatives won the 2015 general election. By the time the 2015 general election rolled around, it looked quite a lot like the worst of the financial crash had been ridden out, but not without a cost. Poverty across Britain had spiked. Food bank use was far beyond anything anyone had seen in 100 years, and homelessness was at an all-time high. For working people, wages had stagnated, the welfare state had been cut to the bone, and local authority budgets slashed. The effects of austerity were now starting to be felt by the working and the middle classes. But I mean, look at this guy. You can't have a guy who eats a bacon sandwich like that running the country, can you now? And this is where the great switcheroo took place, because no longer were the disabled and unemployed being blamed. The blame had been shifted thoroughly onto the EU. More specifically, migrants who had arrived from the EU to work in the UK were now being seen as the enemy, taking vital resources from local authorities and the NHS, resources that British people thought should be there for them.
Yes, the majority of our policies blame people who come from other countries. Employment legislation. Blame immigration. Excessive regulation. Blame immigration. Bad education. Blame immigration. No qualification. Blame immigration. Radicalisation.
Blame immigration.
Unhappy situation.
Blame immigration.
The intimidation in our nation. When we blame immigration is a total abomination.
This xenophobia was being stoked purposely by UKIP and the rest of the far right. Where Labour had previously refused to even discuss the issue of immigration, Conservatives seeking to leave the EU knew that they could harness this hostility towards migrant workers to help them in their campaign to push Britain out of the EU. And with UKIP taking most of the flack as the anti-immigration and racist party, the Conservatives were able to present themselves as the moderate face of people with concerns about immigration. The 2016 EU in-out referendum was bitterly divisive. Labour, having learned lessons regarding campaigning alongside the Tories in the Scottish independence referendum.
People of Glasgow, bow down to your imperial Labour masters! They've used your tax dollars to come all the way from London!
kept their distance from Cameron and his Remain team. The Leave side was split over two distinct campaigns. Leave.eu, headed up by Nigel Farage, and Vote Leave with Boris Johnson and Michael Gove at the helm. Vote Leave pitched itself as a grassroots campaign, mostly concerned with the economic arguments and a bus with a lie on it. Leave.eu, however, focused much more heavily on the issues of immigration, eventually resulting in an almost like-for-like reproduction of actual Nazi propaganda. By now, we know which side won, that David Cameron broke his promise not to step down, Theresa May broke her promise not to have a general election, lost her majority, and consequently failed to deliver her promise of Brexit. A few catastrophic defeats and high-profile resignations later, and Parliament was in deadlock. Boris Johnson was chosen as the new Conservative leader and, who like Tories are known to do, promised to deliver Brexit by October the 31st, and despite his unlawful prorogation of Parliament, failed to get his version of Theresa May's deal through Parliament for a fourth time. Forced into an embarrassing climb down, and to seek an extension he promised not to seek, Johnson did what Tories were best at doing at this point, and sought an extension. This would be the final caveat required to goad Labour into agreeing to dissolve Parliament for a general election.
It's hard to imagine a worse start to any election campaign than that one of your leading lights effectively offends the people of Grenfell by making such crass, insensitive comments.
The Tory campaign of 2017 will go down in history as one of the worst ever. Going into the 2019 campaign, broadcasters and pollsters seemed somewhat reluctant to make any calls on which way this election might go. UKIP's spiritual successor, the Brexit Party, stood down candidates in any seats already held by the Conservatives in a bid to split the Labour vote, and confusion over Labour's Brexit position were giving the Liberal Democrats inroads. That said, it didn't stop Jacob Rees-Mogg appearing to call the victims of Grenfell stupid.
Whatever the Fire Brigade said, we would leave the burning building. It just seems the common sense thing to do.
Mr. Rees-Mogg, do you really think Grenfell residents lacked common sense?
No, that's not what I said.
Resulting in him being hidden away for the remainder of the campaign. But Mogg wouldn't be the only person to go into hiding. Boris hid from the Channel 4 debate, hid from Andrew Neil, and even hid in a fridge to get away from Piers Morgan. Dominic Cummings, Johnson's media strategist, was no slouch. He calculated that having Boris accused of being a chicken was less damaging to the campaign overall than seeing him struggle to answer very simple questions regarding Conservative policy.
How do you feel looking at that photo? Of course.
And let me tell you that I haven't had a chance to look at it.
Why don't look at it now, Prime Minister?
When will you release the Russian report?
Will those nurses still be required if you've sold it to the Americans?
We haven't seen Boris Johnson yet, have we?
Parliament is blocking Brexit, and I'm afraid...
No, hang on, that's not quite right. Parliament voted to accept a reading of your bill. They then didn't want to do it in just 3 days.
How it could be 50,000 more nurses if 19,000 of them are already nurses.
Cummings knew that in order to break down Labour's red wall, he'd have to keep things simple and approachable, and their slogan, unlike Theresa May's, cut straight to the heart of the biggest issue facing the country: get Brexit done.
Meanwhile,
Labour, on the other hand, sought to ask the country to consider life after Brexit.
What Conservative governments always do is look after the very richest within our society. They've done very, very well in the years of austerity, while it's communities all over the country that have paid for it with closed libraries, closed swimming pools, out-of-reach pricing on sports facilities, lack of housing, increased stress, increased mental health stress.
Where the NHS would be placed during trade negotiations with the US? What would be done about issues of homelessness, poverty and wages? Despite being the subject of much derision during the campaign, their proposal of free broadband for every household was actually pretty popular, and their core values of renationalising utilities and transport consistently poll favourably among the British public. As much as Labour tried to make this election about more than Brexit, they failed to provide any single key policy that really cut through the noise, and Jeremy Corbyn's television appearances were mired with controversy surrounding accusations of widespread anti-Semitism from within the membership.
Ephraim Mirvis has said that Jews are justifiably anxious about the idea of Jeremy Corbyn becoming Prime Minister.
Would you like to take this opportunity tonight to apologise to the British Jewish community?
Labour has become the second political party after the BNP to be investigated by the Equality and Human Rights Commission. How do you feel to be in that kind of company?
But whilst Labour were failing to win over trust on issues of anti-Semitism and their spending plans, the Conservatives were getting accused of peddling fake news.
That is fake news. You have deliberately re-edited, as a party, the end of that exchange to make it look like Sir Keir Starmer didn't answer.
The BBC, who were normally held in high regard for their relatively impartial election coverage, came under massive scrutiny for uncritically reporting an assault on a Tory staffer and an arrest that never took place, whilst simultaneously failing to report that 2 Labour activists in their 70s were violently assaulted. One thing was for sure, this would be the dirtiest general election campaign anyone had seen in a generation.
My Brexit is so hard. Makes you say, oh my word, what about my job security, sick pay, healthcare, and the economy? These are 4 things you need to discuss when I say Brexit won't hurt you much. Remember that lies on the side of a bus. I am a guy who you can't trust. Can't trust me. Can't trust me. I promise thousands more police, but that's less than we're already cut. If you trust me, you must be off your nut. I lie to the Queen to get Parliament shut. I say the Tory party is the party of prosperity, but not for the 130,000 people killed by our prosperity, nor for disabled people robbed of money and their dignity, or the millions of children our policies have left in child poverty. Are those kids mine? Probably not, but I won't admit how many I've got.
The Tories never saw great gains in their support. Meanwhile, Labour managed to climb slowly but steadily upwards. Polling guru John Curtis predicted that the true result of the election depended on one thing: turnout. By the final day of voter registration, over 3.5 million mostly younger people had signed up to cast their ballots. This was anything but good news for the Conservatives. Towards the end of the campaign, some polls were showing a Conservative win, and some seemed to be indicating another hung Parliament. Jo Swinson had stopped telling everyone she stood a realistic chance of being the next Prime Minister, and Dominic Cummings was sending bat signals, warning Conservatives not to succumb to hubris because the election was still on a knife edge. If the Remain alliance coordinated itself effectively, and enough young people came out to rebuke right-wing parties, Johnson would be headed straight for a disaster. Having reneged on the red lines promised to the DUP, Johnson and the Tories would have no allies left in the Commons if he failed to secure a majority. Right up until polling day, it appeared that everything was left to play for, and that Labour had closed the gap to within the mystical 6% that John Curtis had predicted would be the difference between a Tory majority and a hung Parliament. Labour's defeat wasn't in of itself all that surprising. Corbyn's popularity had been waning for some time, and Johnson routinely polls as one of Britain's most recognisable political figures, helped in no small part by being the Mayor of London during the Olympic Games. However, the sheer scale of Labour's defeat was something that not even the Tories could have predicted, claiming even such safe Labour territory as Tony Blair's old seat in Sedgefield and Dennis Skinner's seat in Bolsover. Something was immediately clear, that Labour's campaign had gone horribly wrong. Traditional northern working class areas had turned their back on both Corbyn and the Labour Party, but is it fair to assume they switched their votes to the Tories? Was it Corbyn or Brexit to blame? What exactly happened? For this final segment, I'm going to be relying on data collated by DataPraxis in collaboration with YouGov, whose fieldwork polled over 600,000 people from across Britain, averaging over 800 responses per constituency between November and December of 2019. By their analysis, Labour's defeat hinged on 3 key factors. Firstly, around a quarter of Labour Leave voters switched their vote to the Conservatives, accounting for around 800,000 lost votes. Secondly, a higher proportion of Remain voters switched their votes to other Remain parties, like Liberal Democrats, Plaid Cymru or the Green Party, and they accounted for over 1.1 million more lost votes. Thirdly, Leavers and Remainers switching their votes had an overwhelmingly negative opinion of Jeremy Corbyn, highlighted by approximately 250,000 Remain voters switching from Labour to the Conservatives. Labour's vote share decreased in every single part of Britain. The Remain-packed parties failed to unite effectively, refusing to share the data analysis or polling information, and constant infighting and bickering meant that despite their best efforts, a split Remain vote even cost some Labour Remain MPs their seats. However, on analysis of the electoral data, over 78% of Remain-packed party voters would have had to have switched their vote to prevent a Tory majority, a proportion, the report says, to be too high to be realistic. All the while, passionate Leave voters had only a single party to rally around. While the Brexit Party were present, their overall result was embarrassingly poor and utterly failed to recreate anything like the shockwaves UKIP did in 2015. The impact of Brexit on this election is undeniable. The top highest 20 Leave voting seats are now all held by the Conservatives, and the 13 highest remaining vote seats in England are all held by Labour, with the other 7 being held by the SNP in Scotland. While the effectiveness of tactical voting may have been overstated by those promoting it, the report suggests that if deployed properly, it could have reduced the Tory majority by 20 seats. With another 16 seats in the north being vulnerable, but easily defended had Labour campaigned more effectively there. The most notable slogan in the campaign was easily to get Brexit done. Even Remain voters were now beleaguered by the constant parliamentary tug-of-war and believed that other issues were now facing the country that they needed to see resolved. Labour's message, that it was time for real change, which threw the challenge of more of the same at the feet of the Conservative campaign, was squandered, used too little and too inconsistently. Labour's single most effective attack line regarded the encroaching threat of privatisation to the NHS. It was hugely effective, so much so that it forced the Tories into a defensive position on the issue. But throughout the campaign, Labour's messaging became diluted, spread too thin and along too many issues. The most remarkable feature of this campaign was just how many undecided voters there were right until the final days. Neither Corbyn nor Johnson were favourable candidates, both repellent in their own ways to traditional core demographics of their respective parties. If there was one phrase to sum up the character of the 2019 general election, shared by just about half of everyone polled, it was the best of a bad bunch. This is hardly a ringing endorsement for Boris Johnson, whose victory is fragile and who won't have Brexit to shore up his support at the next election. With a tumultuous 5 years ahead and a future path to victory beset on all sides by a possible financial downturn as a result of leaving the EU, and a slew of deprived working class areas looking to him for support, the Conservatives may very well find their success short-lived. Remarkably, the future of this Conservative government is now inexorably linked to the political toings and froings in the United States. Post-Brexit trading plans hinge on being able to secure a prosperous trading deal with America, something Trump has signalled he's prepared to accommodate. But as the only US president to have been successfully impeached and seeking his own re-election later this year, only time will tell if this gamble has paid off, and if the next Labour leader will possess the statesman-like qualities required to make political capital from any potential future failings. But for now, all any of us can do is just wait and see.